Follow the washerwoman, he whispered to himself. If you want the truth, follow her. Fog crept low over the moors that evening, thick as wool. James Ashford rode slowly through it, his horse's hooves dull on the wet road. Up ahead, barely a shadow in a mist, walked a woman carrying a small bundle. She moved with purpose, skirts dragging through the mud, shawl drawn tight against the wind. Her name was Rose Whitmore, the silent washerwoman of Thornfield, and tonight she carried something that did not belong to her. By dawn, she would change everything. That same morning, the estate had glowed gold with sunlight. The smell of soap and wet linen floated up from the stream behind the house. Rose stood knee-deep in the water, sleeves rolled, brown hair pinned loosely beneath her cap. Her hands worked fast, dipping, wringing, scrubbing. She could not hear the laughter of the other servants up by the fence, but she could feel their eyes on her. They called her the Silent One. Some pitied her. Others feared her. None understood her. James watched from his study window, as he had for months. Since the day she'd arrived, poor and thin, hired to wash clothes for a few pennies a week, he had found himself drawn to her stillness. There was something unspoken in her quiet grace, something he could not name. A kind of peace, a kind of sorrow. He had been alone too long. 3 years since his wife and child were buried in the churchyard. The house had grown silent since then. Rooms sealed off, clocks unwound, laughter gone. Yet somehow, when the washerwoman came each morning to the stream, the silence seemed less heavy. He told himself he only watched to ensure good work. But when his housekeeper, Mrs. Dorning, remarked that he'd taken a strange interest in that deaf girl, he didn't deny it. That afternoon, he made a choice. A small one, he told himself. A harmless test. He left a coin purse, plump with silver, on the edge of the washing stone. If she's honest, he thought, she'll bring it back. If not, he didn't finish the thought. He only stepped back into the shadows of the trees and waited. By sunset, the sky burned with red light. Rose was the last at the stream, finishing her day's work. She reached for her shawl and froze. A leather purse lay on the stone, wet from the spray. Her heart leapt in her throat. She looked around. No one, only the murmur of the stream. She touched it lightly. Heavy, too heavy. Coins. Her fingers trembled. A memory flashed. Another job, another accusation. Thief. They had called her when a bracelet went missing. She had not taken it, but who would believe a deaf girl? She fled that place in shame, hungry and alone. Now, here was again a test she had not asked for. She should leave it, walk away, but her stomach twisted. The faces of the children rose before her eyes, thin, pale, waiting in the cold for her return. She bit her lip, hard enough to draw blood, and slid the purse into her shawl. Then she turned and hurried down the road before the light was gone. From the window above, James saw her go. The purse was gone, and so was his peace. He stood still for a long moment, his chest heavy with disappointment. Then he grabbed his coat, called for no servant, and went to the stables himself. The night was coming fast, fog rising from the fields. He mounted his horse and set off quietly, keeping far enough behind her not to be seen. Her figure flickered in and out of the mist, a ghostly shape with a bundle in her arms. Through the village she went, past shuttered shops and lamp-posts glowing faintly in the haze. Then beyond, where the cobblestones gave way to dirt and broken ground, the old mill district, long dead, like so much of England's north after the war. The mills stood empty, their windows like blind eyes. James slowed his horse. "What are you doing, Rose?" he whispered into the fog. "Where are you going?" She turned off the road, pushing through weeds toward a crumbling brick building. The old Haversham mill, half the roof gone, door hanging by one hinge. She slipped inside. James dismounted, heart pounding. For a long moment, he stood in the cold, watching his breath rise like smoke. Then he followed, moving carefully through the wet grass until he reached a broken window. Inside, candlelight flickered. Rose knelt on the floor, her shawl spread before her. The purse lay open, and around her, good Lord, around her were children. 5 of them, small, pale, silent. The oldest, a girl of 12, rocked a baby wrapped in an old blanket. A boy of 10 leaned on a wooden crutch, his leg twisted. 2 twin girls huddled together, eyes wide and hungry. The smallest, no more than 4, sat in Rose's lap, fingers tangled in her hair. James's breath caught. Rose's hands moved quickly, gracefully, forming shapes in the air, signs he could not understand. She counted coins, dividing them into small piles. Then she broke a piece of bread, one of the few things she carried, and split it into 6 parts. 5 she placed gently into tiny hands. The last she kept for herself, barely a crumb. The children ate in silence, eyes shining with trust. James felt the strength leave his legs. He sank to his knees in the mud outside the window, tears spilling down his face. The fog hid his sobs, but not the ache that tore through him. "I thought I knew hunger," he whispered. "I knew nothing." For the first time since his wife's death, James Ashford wept. When he rose again, his decision was already made. He wiped the mud from his coat and pushed open the broken door. Inside, the children startled like frightened birds. Rose sprang to her feet, pulling them behind her. Her eyes went wide when she saw who stood there. James raised his hands slowly, empty palms forward. He spoke softly, though he knew she could not hear. "It's all right," he said. "I won't hurt you." She watched his mouth, unsure. Her body shook with fear. He reached into his coat and drew out a sheet of paper and pencil. He wrote in quick strokes. "Who are they?" She hesitated, then took the pencil and wrote beneath his words with a trembling hand. "Orphans. Mill closed. Parents died. No one wants them." She looked up, eyes wet, then added, "I will return your money. Please do not send constable." James read the words again and again, his vision blurring. He looked around at the thin faces, the candlelight flickering on their hollow cheeks. Then back to her, the woman he had tested. His test had failed, but she had passed in every way that mattered. James stood in the doorway of the ruined mill, the damp air heavy with candle smoke and silence. Rose faced him, trembling, her arms spread in front of the children like a shield. He saw the flicker of fear in her eyes, the kind that comes from a life of being cornered too many times. The children huddled closer to her skirts, thin faces peeking out, their small bodies half hidden by shadows. The smallest boy clung to her hand. James raised his palms slowly, careful not to startle them. He spoke, though he knew his words would not reach her ears. "Please, I mean no harm." His voice broke under the weight of his own guilt. She couldn't hear the tone, but perhaps she could read the shape of his mouth, the sorrow in his face. For a long moment, neither moved. Then he reached into his coat and took out his notebook. On the page, his pencil scratched quickly. "Who are they?" He handed it to her, his hand shaking just slightly. Rose looked at it, then at him, before taking the pencil in her small, work-roughened hand. Her words came slow, careful. "Orphans. Mill closed. Parents died. No one wants them." She hesitated, the pencil hovering, then added, "I will return your money. Please do not send constable." When she pushed the book back to him, her fingers trembled. James read the words over and over, his chest aching more with each line. He looked around, at the old mill walls blackened with soot, at the broken beams, at the small group of children sitting quietly on the cold stone floor, their faces hollow but calm as they watched Rose. He understood, suddenly and painfully, that this woman had stolen not out of greed, but out of mercy. He had tested her soul and found his own wanting. James's knees gave way. He sank into the dirt floor, his head bowed. For years, he had hidden from feeling, burying his grief under the weight of his estate and his silence. But now, tears came, unbidden, falling fast. The children stared in confusion, and Rose, startled, took a step forward. James covered his face, his voice breaking. "I thought I knew hunger," he whispered, though she could not hear. "I knew nothing." When he looked up again, Rose stood a few feet away, cautious but curious. Her eyes, clear gray, rimmed with exhaustion, met his. For the first time, he saw not just her quietness, but her strength. She had kept 5 children alive with nothing but her hands, her will, and her silence. James pulled another sheet from his notebook, the pencil quick between his fingers. "Come to Thornfield, all of you, tonight." Rose stared at the words, disbelief and fear flickering across her face. She shook her head, clutching the baby closer. She took the pencil again. "Charity is cruelty with better manners." Her expression was fierce, protective. He wrote beneath her words, "Not charity, employment." She hesitated. He kept writing, "Head laundress. Your own cottage. Children will work for food and learn to read. You will earn wages. This is business. Do you accept?" She stood there, reading the message again and again. The room felt thick with the weight of choice. Rose bit her lip, then signed something quick to the children. The oldest girl nodded slightly, as though giving permission. Rose lifted her eyes to him and wrote one more word. "Why?" James stared at that word, feeling it pierce straight through the armor he'd worn for 3 years. He looked down, then wrote, slowly and simply, "Because I watched you give them your bread, and I have eaten alone in a house with 20 rooms for 3 years. I am tired of empty tables." He held the paper out to her, hand unsteady. For a long time, she said nothing. Then she nodded. It was small, but it was enough. By the time they stepped out of the mill, the fog had thickened to white sheets across the ground. The moon was a faint smudge above the trees. James led the horse, and Rose walked beside him, her shawl wrapped tightly around the baby, the others following in a silent line. Samuel, the boy with the twisted leg, leaned on his crutch and limped determinedly forward. The twins, Lucy and Jane, clutched each other's hands. Mary, the eldest, carried a small bundle of clothes tied with string. None spoke a word, but their eyes, wide, frightened, hopeful, never left the dark outline of Thornfield rising through the fog. When they reached the great iron gates, Rose stopped short. The place looked unreal to her. Tall chimneys, endless windows, lanterns glowing faintly at the doors. She touched James's sleeve and shook her head, trying to turn back. But he pointed to the servant's path and mouthed the words, "Trust me." They moved quietly up the side road until they reached the east wing, where the old cottages stood. The main house lights flickered, and a door opened. Out came Mrs. Dorning, the housekeeper, in her nightcap and shawl, her face sharp with anger. "Mr. Ashford, what is the meaning of this?" she demanded, staring at the ragged group behind him. "Bringing beggars to the estate at this hour?" James stood tall, his voice calm but firm. "Prepare the east cottage," he said. "Her name is Miss Whitmore." Mrs. Dorning's mouth fell open. "Miss? Sir, she's a laundress." "You cannot." But James didn't let her finish. "That will be all," he said quietly, and the authority in his tone left no room for argument. With a huff of outrage, the housekeeper vanished into the night. Within the hour, candles glowed in the windows of the east cottage. The place was small but solid. 3 rooms, a hearth, real beds instead of straw piles, glass in the windows. The children stepped inside slowly, as though they might break something by breathing too hard. The little boy, Thomas, touched the wooden table, eyes wide. Mary helped him climb onto a chair. The twins curled up together near the hearth. Samuel sat quietly by the door, watching everything with careful eyes. When a tray of food arrived, warm bread, stew, and milk, the smell filled the cottage like a promise. Rose stared at it, but didn't move. Her hands trembled as she looked at James. She touched her throat, then her heart, as if to ask whether she might truly eat it. He pulled his notebook again and wrote the words, "There will always be more." For a moment, she didn't believe him. Then Slowly, she reached for a piece of bread. The first bite seemed to take every bit of courage she had left. Her eyes filled with tears she didn't wipe away. Around her, the children began to eat, laughter and small sighs of happiness breaking the long silence. The fire crackled. Outside, the fog lifted, and the first faint stars appeared above Thornfield. James lingered at the door, watching them, 6 figures in the golden light of the hearth, a family he hadn't known he needed. He closed the door softly behind him and walked back to the main house, his chest heavy but full in a way it hadn't been in years. For the first time in a long while, the silence of Thornfield did not feel empty. It felt alive. And somewhere deep inside, James Ashford knew that his test had not revealed her character. It had revealed his own. The night had folded itself into stillness when James returned to the East Cottage. A thin curl of smoke rose from the chimney, and through the window he saw the faint glow of the fire, the shapes of the sleeping children curled together under blankets. Rose sat by the hearth, her back straight, eyes fixed on the flames as if afraid they might disappear. When he knocked softly, she startled, but then relaxed when she saw it was him. James stepped inside, removing his hat. The air was warmer here, gentler somehow, filled with the quiet breath of safety. He held out a small packet, bread, a little sugar, a pot of tea. She hesitated before taking it, then nodded in thanks. He didn't linger long that night, only wrote a few words in his notebook before leaving. Sleep well. You are safe. She read it twice, her lips trembling as if to form words she could not say. The next morning, Rose woke before dawn. Old habits of hardship die hard. She dressed quietly, careful not to wake the children, and stepped outside into the chill air. The estate loomed in mist, grand and silent, as though watching her. By sunrise, she was already at the wash-house, scrubbing the linens of Thornfield with steady hands, her movements quick and practiced. The servants who passed whispered behind her back, eyes narrowing. Mrs. Dorning's dismissal had become the latest gossip, and the mute woman, with her brood of orphans, was now the scandal of Thornfield. Still, Rose kept her head down, pretending she could not see the sneers. By midday, James appeared, a quiet presence by the doorway. He set down a small tin beside her, a bar of new soap from London, wrapped in blue paper. When she looked up, puzzled, he smiled faintly. He mouthed the words, "For you." She nodded once in acknowledgement, but her gaze slipped quickly back to her work. Yet that night, when she returned to the cottage and unwrapped the paper, she held the soap like it was something precious, something she hadn't known she was allowed to receive. Over the next week, life began to shift at Thornfield. The children, once thin and timid, started to find their place. Mary helped in the kitchen, careful and serious. Samuel tended the gardens, though his limp slowed him. The twins gathered eggs and sang softly to the hens, their laughter bright even if Rose couldn't hear it. Little Thomas followed her everywhere, mimicking her gestures and splashing his tiny hands in the washtubs. Slowly, the cottage came alive with light and warmth. Yet not everyone approved. Among the staff, jealousy simmered. Whispers passed like smoke. She bewitched him, she's playing a game. Some of the servants began to play cruel tricks, burning bread meant for the children, spilling water buckets near her work, hiding her clean linens. Rose never protested. She simply worked harder, her silence both shield and curse. Then came the night of the torn dress. Lucy, one of the twins, returned from the henhouse with her sleeve ripped wide open. Rose understood at once that it wasn't an accident. Still, she said nothing. That evening, when the children slept, she sat alone by candlelight, needle and thread in hand, mending the small pink dress stitch by stitch. Her eyes burned with exhaustion, but she worked on, determined to make it whole again. It was near midnight when James found her there. "You should be asleep," he said softly, stepping into the doorway. She looked up, startled, then quickly bent her head again. He glanced at the torn fabric in her hands, and the way her fingers trembled. "Let me buy new cloth," he offered gently. She shook her head, writing on a scrap of paper. "She likes this one." He smiled, understanding more in her few words than most could say in 100. "Then Lucy shall keep it," he said, voice thick with something tender. The following day, James began a strange new habit. At night, long after the house was asleep, he sat in his study, surrounded by books, not about business or estates, but about language. A book of sign language from London, heavy and awkward, lay open under lamplight. He practiced the shapes with his fingers, clumsy at first, tracing letters in the air. 2 weeks passed before he dared to try. One bright morning, as Rose stood by the stream scrubbing sheets, she saw a shadow fall across the water. She looked up to see James standing there, looking nervous as a schoolboy. Slowly, he raised his hands. The signs came stiff, awkward, but clear enough. "Good morning." Rose froze. For a heartbeat, she didn't breathe. Then her eyes filled with tears. She signed back, "Good morning, Mr. Ashford." His grin was wide and unpracticed, but it lit his whole face. From that day on, they met each evening in the cottage, where the children giggled and clapped as he fumbled through the alphabet, spelling each of their names with great seriousness. He signed Lucy, then Jane, then Samuel, and they squealed with delight. Even little Thomas tried, his tiny fingers mimicking shapes he didn't yet understand. Laughter filled the room, a sound Rose could only feel through the vibrations in the floor, but she felt it just the same. It hummed through her chest like sunlight. In those quiet evenings, James and Rose began to speak without words. Bit by bit, she told him her story. She signed how her parents had hidden her away out of shame, how she had taught herself to read by candlelight, tracing letters from the laundry list she washed. She told of losing everything when a bracelet went missing in her last position, how no one believed her, how she'd run with nothing but her hands and a promise to protect the abandoned children she'd found one by one among the ruins. James listened, eyes burning, every motion of her hands carving itself into his heart. When she finished, he sat very still before signing back. "You were silent by birth. I was silent by choice. Both are prisons." She looked at him then, a long and steady look that said she understood. From that night onward, there was no barrier between them that mattered. Days turned to weeks. The cottage became a home. The children laughed more freely, their cheeks flushed with health. The staff began, grudgingly, to soften, perhaps because James himself now spent his meals at the cottage, preferring their rough laughter and Rose's quiet company to the polished emptiness of the main dining hall. One evening, as he watched her fold freshly dried linens by the firelight, James thought how strange it was that the woman he'd once suspected of theft had given him back more than he'd ever lost. The house that had echoed with loneliness now rang with small footsteps, gentle laughter, and the rhythm of life returning. Outside, spring began to stir the grounds, but inside it was already warm. Thornfield was alive again, not because of its master, but because of the washerwoman who could not hear and yet had somehow taught them all how to listen. Morning light spilled through the cottage windows, golden and soft, catching in the curls of steam that rose from the wash house across the yard. The first week at Thornfield moved with quiet rhythm, like the beginning of a new song. Rose was up before the dawn bell, hands already in the cold water, her movements practiced and sure. Around her, the small world she had built began to grow roots. The children found their places with surprising speed. Mary in the kitchen under Mrs. Phelps's watchful eye, Samuel limping steadily through the gardens with his crutch and small basket for herbs, the twins collecting eggs from the hen house while giggling at the hens' outraged squawks, and little Thomas following his mother everywhere, a blur of motion and bright eyes. The other servants, though, were not so easily changed. They whispered as Rose passed, their voices carrying cruel music she could not hear but could feel all the same. She saw it in the tight mouths, the sideways looks, the sudden hush that fell whenever she entered a room. She bewitched him. Someone murmured once, too near the door. He's lost his mind for a laundress and her strays. Rose ignored them all, throwing herself into work, scrubbing and mending until her fingers ached. But cruelty has a way of finding cracks. One morning, Lucy came running to her with tears on her cheeks and the sleeve of her dress torn wide open. Rose examined the rip and saw the deliberate knife slice along the seam. That night, when the children were asleep, she sat by candlelight mending it, her head bowed over the small pink fabric, the flame flickering shadows across her tired face. She worked until her eyes burned and her hands cramped, because Lucy loved that dress and because no one else would care for it. When James found her there, the candle nearly burned to the wick, he paused in the doorway, something tightening in his chest. "You should rest," he said quietly, stepping closer. Rose looked up, startled, then shook her head and returned to her work. He noticed how carefully she stitched each line, how her mouth moved as though whispering to herself, though she could not hear the sound. "Let me buy new cloth," he offered, meaning it kindly. She frowned, scribbling quickly on a scrap of paper. "No, she likes this one." He smiled, understanding, and said softly, "Then Lucy shall keep it." That night, he lay awake long after the house went still, his mind full of her face in the candlelight. By the second week, he had made a decision. From London, he ordered a book on sign language, strange and heavy, filled with illustrations of hands mid-gesture. Late at night, while the fire died low, he studied alone, mimicking the shapes until his fingers cramped. The next morning, his butler found him practicing the alphabet at the breakfast table and stared as if his master had lost all reason. James only smiled. 2 weeks later, when Rose was by the stream hanging linens in the wind, he approached her. She turned, surprised, wiping her hands on her apron. Slowly, clumsily, he raised his hands and signed, "Good morning." The words were stiff, awkward, but the meaning was clear. Rose froze, the cloth slipping from her fingers. Then her face softened, something fragile and bright breaking through. She signed back, carefully, "Good morning, Mr. Ashford." It was the first time he'd ever seen her smile fully. From that day forward, a new rhythm began. Each evening after supper, James came to the cottage for lessons. The children would gather close, laughing as he fumbled through letters and phrases, his fingers tangled in confusion. The twins found endless delight in his mistakes, clapping their hands whenever he got something right. Even Samuel, usually so serious, grinned as he helped correct the shapes of James's fingers. Rose, patient and calm, guided him gently, touching his hand to correct a motion, her eyes lighting with quiet amusement when he finally mastered sign. The cottage, once so still, now shimmered with a kind of life even in silence. One night, when the children were asleep, Rose told them her story through signs. She told of a childhood spent in quiet shadow, hidden away by parents too proud and too frightened of a world that called her less. She told them how she had learned to read by stealing glimpses of the Bible her mother kept by the bed, how she traced each letter until words made sense in her hands. She told them how, after her parents died, she had been cast out, how she had taken work in one house after another until false accusation had driven her onto the road, and how, in the ruins of the old mill, she had found the children. First Mary, alone and starving, then the twins, then Samuel with his broken leg, and finally baby Thomas. As her hands moved through the story, her face changed, soft and full of pain, but strong too, stronger than he had ever seen. James sat silent, barely breathing. When she finished, he reached out, hesitated, then signed slowly. "You were silent by birth. I was silent by choice. Both are prisons." Rose blinked, tears rising, and for a moment she reached for his hand before pulling back quickly, embarrassed. He didn't let go. "We can both learn to speak again," he said softly, and she understood every word by the shape of his lips. From then on, Thornfield changed in quiet, almost invisible ways. The servants still whispered, but the air around the cottage seemed to hum with something bright. The children grew stronger. Samuel could walk longer distances. Mary began to hum as she worked. The twins read their first letters aloud. And Thomas, little Thomas, spoke his first word, a soft, imperfect ma, though his hands made the sign perfectly. The day he did, James happened to be there, and he saw the look on Rose's face, a mix of shock, pride, and joy so deep it almost hurt to see. By early spring, the estate had begun to breathe again. The gardens bloomed early, the fields looked greener, and even the maids laughed more freely. Some swore it was the warm winter that had done it, but others whispered that it was the washerwoman and her brood who had brought luck back to Thornfield. At dinner, James no longer ate alone. He preferred the cottage table, where mismatched plates and childish chatter made the food taste better. Often he found himself watching Rose more than his meal. The way she moved, graceful even in her quiet, how she seemed to listen not with her ears, but with her whole being. And when she laughed silently, her shoulders shaking and her eyes alight, he thought he had never seen anything more beautiful. That night, walking back to the main house beneath the budding trees, James thought of his wife's portrait, long since covered in dust upstairs. He thought of the years of grief that had dulled him, and he thought of the woman who had arrived in silence and somehow taught him to listen again. Thornfield, for the first time in years, was alive, not because of its master, but because of a woman who had given voice to silence and warmth to every corner she touched. Spring sunlight had only just begun to warm Thornfield when the peace shattered. It started as a whisper, the kind that slithered through the servants' quarters and grew teeth by the time it reached the main hall. "Silver's gone," someone muttered, eyes darting toward the east cottage. By noon, the rumor had caught like wildfire. Mrs. Dorning, newly rehired after weeks of begging and promising better behavior, had wasted no time in stirring old poison. She marched through the corridor, skirts snapping with righteous fury, announcing that the fine silver spoons from the master's dining room had disappeared. And who else could it be, she hissed, but the washerwoman and her little thieves? The word spread faster than truth ever could. That afternoon, Rose was called to the yard, her hands still wet from scrubbing. She saw the constable's horse tied near the gate, its saddle glinting in the sun, and her heart fell before anyone even spoke. Mrs. Dorning stood there, chin lifted high, her eyes burning with triumph. "You see, Mr. Ashford is in London," she said loudly to the constable. "But I act in his stead. Search the cottage. The mute one's been hiding something." The constable hesitated. He had heard stories of Rose Whitmore, the deaf laundress who turned Thornfield's luck, but Mrs. Dorning's authority and sharp tongue left him little choice. "I have no quarrel with you, miss," he said awkwardly, tipping his hat, "but I'll need to look around." Rose tried to protest, hands trembling as she signed rapidly, but her words vanished in air no one could understand. The children stood behind her in terror, huddled like a flock of frightened birds. Samuel gripped his crutch tighter, eyes blazing. "She didn't take anything," he cried. The constable gave him a sad look and began his search. Drawers overturned, linens tossed aside. Rose stood frozen, watching years of careful order turn to chaos. When the constable reached the laundry basket by the hearth, he lifted a folded sheet and froze. There, beneath it, gleamed the unmistakable shine of silver. 2 spoons and a small fork. Mrs. Dorning gasped in triumph. "There, proof enough, I'd say," she declared, her voice sharp with satisfaction. Rose's face drained of color. Her knees gave way, and she clutched the edge of the table to keep from falling. She shook her head wildly, signing desperately, pointing toward the basket, toward the door, anywhere but at herself. But it was no use. The constable sighed, pulling out his notebook. "I'm sorry, miss," he said quietly. I have to take you in." The children cried out, Samuel stepping in front of Rose, planting his crutch between her and the constable. "No," he shouted. "She didn't. I saw Mrs. Dorning near the cottage this morning." The woman's eyes flashed. "Lies from a crippled boy," she spat. "They're all the same. Thieves, everyone." Rose's trembling hand found Samuel's shoulder, urging him back. Her eyes met the constable's, filled with that same calm despair James had once seen by the stream. It was happening again. The false accusation, the humiliation, the helplessness. She nodded once, slowly, as though surrendering to the weight of the world. Then, from a lane, came the sound of hooves, fast, hard, urgent. A carriage burst through the gates, mud flying from its wheels. James leapt down before it even stopped. "What's going on?" he demanded, his voice thunder in the spring air. The constable straightened. "Sir, there's been a theft. Silver found in the woman's. Enough," James barked, striding forward. He looked at Rose, pale, shaking, eyes full of something that nearly broke him, and then at Mrs. Dorning, whose smug expression faltered beneath his gaze. "Release her," he ordered the constable. "Now." "Let sir do it." The man obeyed at once. James turned to Mrs. Dorning, his face carved from stone. "I suppose you thought me blind as well as foolish," he said softly. "But I left that silver marked, with invisible ink only visible by heat. The same mark I showed the stable boy this morning when I told him to watch who came near the cottage." Mrs. Dorning blanched, her mouth opening and closing soundlessly. James stepped closer, his voice a whip. "He saw you, Mrs. Dorning. He saw you slip into the cottage while they were in the wash house. He saw you hide those pieces in the basket yourself. I was protecting this house," she stammered, clutching at her apron. "From her. She's a deaf, mute collecting strays. She's made a fool of you, sir, and of this estate." James's voice went cold. "You were protecting your prejudice," he said, "and you've shamed yourself. You are dismissed. Pack what you own and be gone before nightfall." Mrs. Dorning's face twisted, rage and humiliation fighting for space. She turned to the constable, but he had already stepped away, his sympathy clearly with the woman she'd tried to destroy. "Come along, Mrs. Dorning," he said quietly. "I think we've done enough damage here." As they disappeared down the lane, the yard fell silent except for the wind. James turned slowly back to Rose. The children rushed to her at once, Mary clutching her waist, the twins crying openly, Samuel leaning on his crutch, trembling with fury and relief. Little Thomas buried his face in her skirt. Rose held them all, shaking, her eyes full of tears she didn't bother to hide. James approached, stopping just in front of her. For a moment, neither moved. Then he raised his hands, his fingers unsteady but sure enough to sign, "I am sorry. I should have protected you better." Rose blinked, tears sliding down her cheeks. She touched his wrist lightly, her fingers moving in slow, deliberate signs. "You came back." James nodded once, his throat too tight to speak. "Always," he signed. "I will always come back." The children watched, wide-eyed and silent, understanding more than words could carry. Later, when the sun dipped low and the shadows stretched long across the garden, James walked with Rose along the stream where they'd first truly seen each other. The water murmured softly, the same as before, but everything else had changed. He spoke quietly, his voice low and steady. "You don't ever have to run again," he said. She watched his lips and then reached for his hand, pressing it once in silent reply. That night, Thornfield seemed to exhale. The servants, chastened and shaken, moved quietly about their work. The rumor of Rose's guilt vanished as quickly as it had begun, replaced by something else, something closer to awe. For in a house long haunted by grief and suspicion, truth had finally taken root. Inside the cottage, laughter returned. The children clung to Rose as if afraid she might vanish, and she let them, her arms open and trembling. James lingered near the door, watching them with a kind of reverence. In that small space, No grand hall, no fine parlor. He saw what home truly meant. The firelight flickered over their faces, warm and alive, and he thought of how far they'd all come from the fog and fear of that first night. As he laughed, Rose looked up and met his gaze. No words, no signs, just the understanding that something new had been forged in the ashes of that terrible day. Trust, once broken in both their lives, had been remade. And though the house beyond still loomed large and cold, Thornfield was no longer hollow. It was filled with laughter, with forgiveness, and with the quiet strength of a love that asked for nothing in return. 3 months passed, and Thornfield bloomed again, its gray stones softened by the colors of spring. The once empty gardens now rang with laughter, the kind that carried through open windows and down sunlit paths. Roses climbed the cottage walls, their scent drifting through the air like a quiet hymn of renewal. The children, once pale and frightened, were transformed. Samuel, now with a proper leg brace crafted by the village blacksmith, walked almost evenly, his limp barely noticeable as he chased after the twins. Mary had taken charge of the little household like a young mother, her hair neatly braided, her hands sure as she prepared breakfast. Lucy and Jane darted through the gardens like sparrows, dresses flying, faces flushed with life. Even Thomas, who had barely spoken before, now chattered in half-formed words while his hands signed with growing skill. He had learned both speech and silence, just as they all had learned something new at Thornfield, what it meant to belong. Rose watched them from the cottage porch, her face calm but radiant. She no longer moved with the cautious reserve of the outsider. Her silence had become a strength everyone respected. The servants who once whispered now greeted her with nods and smiles. Some even came to her for help with mending or a kind word written on her slate. The estate itself seemed to reflect her transformation, cleaner, brighter, more alive. And at the center of it all was James Ashford, no longer the somber widower who had walked through his house like a ghost. He had changed in ways both quiet and profound. He no longer ate in the grand dining hall, but preferred the company of Rose and the children in their cozy cottage. His hand spoke as easily as his mouth now, his signing fluid and graceful. He could talk with them all, Samuel about the gardens, the twins about their lessons, and Rose about everything that filled the long days and longer nights. Every evening they sat by the fire, the children scattered around them, while James and Rose signed stories and plans. It was not the grand life of society, but it was fuller than any he had known. Yet one warm evening, as the sun melted into the horizon and the scent of roses filled the air, James felt the familiar restlessness of something unfinished. He walked alone through the gardens, his thoughts circling the same truth he'd carried for weeks. When he returned, Rose was sitting outside, the twilight painting her face in soft gold. The children were asleep, their laughter lingering faintly in the air. James approached quietly, holding a folded sheet of paper. He stood before her for a moment, his heart hammering like a young man's, then handed it to her without a word. She looked up in question, but unfolded it carefully. The words were written in his careful, slanted script. You taught me that silence is not emptiness. That family is choice, not blood. That love is presence, not words. Will you marry me? Not to save you. You saved yourself, but because I love you in every way I know. Rose's hand trembled slightly as she read. She lifted her eyes, wide and full of emotion. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then she took his hand and wrote on the back of his note, I cannot hear vows spoken or music at a wedding, or the words I do. Her face was sad but calm, as though preparing to step away from something beautiful she did not believe she could keep. But James only smiled, shaking his head. Slowly, he raised his hands and signed. Then we will sign them. We will feel them. We will know them. Rose covered her mouth, a soft gasp escaping though she made no sound. Then she wrote, tears falling freely now. Yes, 1,000 times yes. The wedding came 6 weeks later, small but bright as spring itself. The chapel on the Thornfield grounds had not seen such joy in years. Candles burned along the stone walls, their flames dancing like tiny stars. The children dressed in new clothes that the village seamstress had sewn. Mary in a pale blue gown, Samuel proud in a gray suit, the twins clutching baskets of petals, and Thomas, solemn and determined, carrying the rings on a little pillow. He dropped them halfway down the aisle, of course, and everyone laughed, even the vicar. Rose's gown was simple, cream-colored linen trimmed with lace at the sleeves. She walked down the aisle with Thomas, holding her hand, her steps steady and sure. James waited at the altar, his face glowing with quiet joy. The vicar began the ceremony, his voice warm, but it was when the vows came that time itself seemed to pause. James and Rose faced each other, their hands moving together in perfect unison, signing the words of their vows. I promise my heart, my home, my days, and my silence. It was a sight that left even the servants weeping. Two people speaking in a language few understood, yet conveying more love than any words could hold. When the vows ended, James took her hand gently, and the vicar said, "You may seal your vows." Their first kiss was soft, tender, a moment of stillness that carried every word they had never spoken. The children cheered, petals flying in every direction, laughter filling the chapel like music. Even the old gardener, standing at the back, wiped at his eyes. Afterward, they celebrated outside under the wide Thornfield sky. Tables were set in the gardens, and the cook had outdone herself. Pies, roasts, and fresh bread laid out like a feast. The children ran barefoot through the grass, their laughter carrying through the air as the sun sank behind the hills. Mary played nurse to the baby. The twins chased Samuel until he threatened to use his crutch as a sword, and Thomas fell asleep on a picnic blanket halfway through a slice of cake. James and Rose sat together on the porch of their cottage, watching it all unfold. The glow from the windows spilled across the lawn, warm and golden, lighting the faces of the children inside who would never again know hunger or fear. Rose leaned against James's shoulder, her fingers tracing a slow circle on his sleeve. He looked down at her, smiling softly. Neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. The peace between them said everything. In that moment, Thornfield stood not as a symbol of wealth or power, but of renewal, of what love could rebuild from ashes. The man who had once mourned in silence, and the woman who had lived her life unheard had found, together, a language greater than sound. As night fell, fireflies rose from the grass, tiny lights weaving through the air like blessings. The stars above glimmered faintly, reflected in the stream that once divided them. Now it bound them instead. James kissed the top of Rose's head and whispered words she couldn't hear, but felt in the way he held her close. Inside, the children stirred, safe in their beds, dreaming of tomorrows bright and unbroken. The estate that had once echoed with loneliness now pulsed with life. And in that quiet, eternal moment, it was clear, some love stories don't need sound to be heard. They only need truth and the courage to begin again. Sometimes the quietest love speaks the loudest.